Welcome to the Road to Memory Improvement, a 6-week series on the basics of building a better brain. I'm your host, Dr. Michael Trayford, and I'll be your teacher and guide on this unique learning experience. And this week's webinar will be Biomarkers of Memory, Clues from Your Body that Tell Us About Your Brain. This is a really important episode, and we have a lot of information as usual that we're going to pack into a fairly short period of time. So again, that's why we have the webinars, so we can go back and review and start to look at things that we might want to expand on ourselves. We're going to try to touch base on a number of concepts and topics over the course of this webinar series that are really just designed to help open your eyes and open your mind to the fact that there are things out there that we can look at, that we can measure, that we can do to help improve our brain function. This is really important because, again, the whole purpose of this series is to help us build a better brain. And it is attainable, it is doable, and most of us in any circumstance can in fact do that. So some housekeeping details. Again, our format is 2 parts for each session. So this is session 2, part 1. And the first part will be more educational based, and the second part will be more application based. So you will have 2 20 to 30 minute portions of each weekly webinar session, and you can go ahead and look those up easy. They will be labeled appropriately, and you'll be able to spend a little bit more time in areas that you might want to learn more about, or areas where you simply want to gain as much of the application as possible to be able to implement it in your daily life. And that's really what it's all about, giving you tools and strategies and education that you can implement into your daily life that will have a significant impact on your brain, your body, and your life. So with that said, the information contained in this workshop is for educational purposes only and is not designed to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease. Again, we're not able to go through evaluations and histories and diagnostic testing with each individual, so therefore we're not able to render any type of diagnosis, treat, or cure any conditions, but we are providing valuable information that will help you to expand your scope of knowledge and also application tips and tools that you can put into your daily life that will absolutely have an impact on your brain and body health. So this is really important information. I'm glad you're with us. It's an absolute pleasure to be able to help guide you through this experience and share my knowledge from 17 plus years of clinical practice and the amazing things that we see on a day-to-day basis in our clinic that we're able to share with a much larger group of people through the means of these types of webinars. So we're going to go ahead and move forward, and just to touch base on the topic at hand, we're looking at the road to memory improvement. Again, this is a road. It's not one step. It's not a silver bullet. We have a road to go down, and we're right at the beginning of this journey. Last week we learned about neuroplasticity and the brain's ability to change and grow over time. Now we're going to learn today about certain things that will tell us about our brain, and this is biomarkers of memory. And these are clues from your body that tell us about your brain. So you're already understanding that the term biomarker simply means clue. It tells us about what's going on. So that said, we're going to jump right into it and go through the question here. What is a biomarker? Well, life is another word for bio. So biomarker is essentially a marker of life. It's a clue to your health. And where we're concerned, what we're talking about this day is a clue to your brain health more importantly. These are keys from your body that will tell us about your brain health. So these are functional indicators of health observed from the outside. Now you'll hear that term a lot, functional. Functional tells us about things that we can change. We can change function. Structure, on the other hand, is something that is a bit more concrete. When you're looking at pathology, whether it's a stroke or cancer, things like that, these are structural changes that happen in the brain and the body that cause significant problems and require much more drastic interventions. When we're talking about function, these are things that are often well within our control and something we can do quite a bit about. So these are functional indicators of health observed from outside the individual. These are in contrast, in sharp contrast to symptoms, which are often unreliable. Whether it's pain, whether it's memory loss, we often can't rely on someone's reporting of a symptom to determine the extent of the injury or damage or concern at hand. From a pain perspective, perfect example, you have people with high thresholds and low thresholds of pain, or high tolerance and low tolerance for pain. So one person's 1 on a scale of 1 to 10 is another person's 10 on a scale of 1 to 10. So highly unreliable. Again, subjective symptoms are just not the best indicator, so we need to look at some things we can really hang our hat on. Biomarkers accurately and reproducibly measure function in most cases. So these are things that we can put numbers to. These are things we can compare to databases to look at people that don't have any particular problems to see where an individual stands compared to that particular group. So if we're looking at balance, for example, we can look at a 55-year-old male versus other 55-year-old males with no particular problems. So really important. They can be measured highly accurately in most cases. Now, biomarkers used to be related strictly to blood-based findings. So you draw some blood, you look at blood sugar, you look at cholesterol, all these different things. Those were what generally were considered biomarkers. Now they extend to all human functions. So we can look at so many things. The list goes on and on and on. And we're really just going to kind of scratch the surface today on biomarkers of body and brain function. So, with that, we are going to go at a pretty fast clip through this information because I just want to expose you to the various biomarkers and give you a couple little tidbits on each one. So biomarkers that tell us about your memory and cognitive function, what are they? So this is what we're concerned about, and this is what we're wanting to expose you to. You may be familiar with some, and others you may really you may be shocked to understand that some of these are actually telling us about how our brain is working. So pretty interesting to see people's reactions in a live setting, and I know that some folks will be a bit amazed by some of these and how closely linked they are to brain function. So here we go. Biomarkers that tell us about your memory and cognitive function. Number 1, smell. Smell has been around for a while as a biomarker of brain function. So we'll expand on each one of these. I'm just going to go through the list right now. So other biomarkers would be sit to stand, so somebody's ability to get up from a chair. That tells us a lot about brain function. Balance, gait or walking. Cognitive testing, that seems like the obvious one right there, and that's really what's used in many offices. These mini mental status evaluations is a form of cognitive testing that's used to screen for Alzheimer's and other types of dementia. Eye movements can tell us about your brain. Laboratory testing can tell us about your brain. Diagnostic imaging. So there are certain tests now from a diagnostic imaging standpoint, pictures of your brain that will tell us what's happening. So moving forward, smell. We're going to break each one down now into a couple of key points and really help you to understand that how these things are related and why they're related. We had done an introductory webinar leading into the series that some may have heard, and we talked about the canary in the coal mine. Things that tell us that something is going wrong in the brain or the body. Well, smell was one of the original canaries in the coal mine with regard to memory loss or cognitive dysfunction or Alzheimer's, which is really what most people think of. We'll talk about this, but there are many, many types of dementia. There are many types of cognitive impairment. Alzheimer's is just one simple type, so we just want to get an understanding of that right off the bat, that not all dementia is Alzheimer's. It's just one piece. So we're going to go ahead and talk about smell a little bit as telling us about brain function. So smell has been called the canary in the coal mine. There was some interesting research published in the Journal of the American Medical Association in November of 2015, and they talked about adults with impaired smell were over twice as likely to develop memory problems. That's significant, twice as likely. So if you had impaired smell, you were at a double the risk, essentially, of developing memory problems. Those with existing memory problems, what we call mild cognitive impairment, had a much more significant progression to Alzheimer's if they had smell problems with existing memory issues. So again, a really accurate, reliable predictor of function in many, many cases. So we'll learn too that going through exercises and applications at the end of part 2 of this particular webinar on biomarkers of memory, that there are other reasons that smell can be impaired. People with allergies, congestion, deviated septums, damage to the olfactory nerve, which helps you smell. But in general, people that don't have any impairments should be able to smell fairly accurately, and we can use that as a predictor of cognitive decline. So the science is accumulating for things like rosemary. Rosemary has been looked at as a powerful source of brain or memory enhancement. They talk about certain aspects of memory being enhanced by as much as 75% in some recent literature, and this helping specific aspects of memory like working and long-term memory, so more the short and long-term aspects of memory. So that's pretty significant that a smell type of therapy can improve certain aspects of memory by 75%. This is functional neurology. This is how things can change in the brain, and this is why we utilize the literature to help direct the types of interventions that we offer or recommend to folks. So that's smell. The second one, sit to stand. This is a very simple test of general fitness. So it's a valuable measurement of general fitness. General fitness talks about how well your brain is working, because generally people that are not physically fit, they don't have the best brain, so to speak. Now, there are always exceptions to the rule, but in general, when people can't get up and down well, when they can't move well, their cognitive function is proportionally impaired as well. So this involves the musculoskeletal, so getting your joints and muscles and all to move to get you up and down, but also coordination between parts of the nervous system like your inner ear balance or vestibular system. So your nervous system has to communicate with your musculoskeletal system to get you up out of a chair unassisted. If you need assistance, that talks about breakdown in some of these functions. So those with poor results often have cognitive impairment. When I do these types of tests in a large setting, or when I do these types of demonstrations in a large setting, and I've done them with as many as 150 or 200 people in an audience, and you look, and usually about a quarter of the audience has a significant problem getting up out of chair. Now, there could be hip or back or knee or ankle or foot issues, but by and large, it's generally because they can't coordinate that type of movement to get up out of the chair effectively. And then when you start talking with these individuals, you realize often that there is some type of cognitive impairment. Now, this rise to stand from the floor is kind of a more advanced version of the sit to stand, but people are actually sitting on the floor and they rise to a standing position from the floor. Now, I don't recommend everybody try this because it can be difficult for some that have physical and cognitive impairments. But if you use one or no hands getting up, it just indicates a general overall increased fitness level and lower mortality rate. They're actually looking at this test being able to get up off the floor from a seated position on the floor as a predictor of mortality. This is significant. So people that have the inability to do that, barring any physical ailments or anything like that, that talks about the possibility of them having significant cognitive impairment and increased risk of mortality. Now, the rise to stand testing, this is a test where people are actually sitting on the floor and they get up from a seated position on the floor. And if they use one or no hands in getting up from the floor, then they generally have an increased level of fitness and a lower mortality rate. So this rise to stand from the floor is well documented in the literature as being a predictor of mortality. So this is significant. It takes a good brain to coordinate movements to get people up off of the floor with little to no assistance. So this is something to do, and I wouldn't necessarily recommend it for every individual to go try this activity, particularly if there are major physical impairments and cognitive impairments. We want to make sure anything we're doing in this series that we're doing things in a safe manner and within our known limits. Now, some people might not know they have certain problems. That's why we want to do everything in a safe environment. So anything that involves balance or getting up from the floor or out of a chair, we want to do these in areas where we have something that could catch us, like a chair or a couch or a bed, or having a carpeted floor or something like that. So we just want to maintain a certain sense of understanding of safety as we're doing these types of activities. So we move on to balance. Balance is probably one of the most important and accurate predictors of brain function, and the literature continues to accumulate in this realm, talking about how significant balance is in relation to our higher cognitive functions, because our balance system, our inner ear mechanisms, plugs directly into our front brain, which has a lot to do with our higher cognitive capacities. It plugs into our emotional brain. It plugs into many, many, many different parts of the brain. So really important. So it takes a good brain to stand on 2 feet. When we're standing on 2 feet, we're essentially resisting falling all the time because we have a very small base. And it takes an even better brain to stand on 1 foot. So these are things we need to look at in individuals and see how they can tolerate doing them. So balance is strongly linked to memory and higher cognitive functions. You can go onto the internet and just put in a search for balance and memory, or balance and cognition, and you will get all kinds of references and resources popping up talking about the connections between the two. These things have been observed for over a half a century and really are gaining significant traction in terms of rehabilitating cognitive functions through physical activities like balance. So generally speaking, the greater the dysfunction with balance, the greater the degree of cognitive decline in most cases. Now, there are always exceptions to the rule. People that have been wheelchair bound for many, many years that have great cognitive function, and sometimes the other way around, where people are quite mobile and have great balance but have low cognitive function. There's always exceptions to the rule, but generally speaking, the greater the level of balance problems, the greater the level of memory and cognitive problems. So we can test balance under many, many circumstances, and we can assess different brain regions by looking at balance with eyes open, eyes closed, on a stable surface, on an unstable surface, things like moving your eyes in different directions, turning your head. So these things are done under parameters, safe parameters in a controlled environment. And there's a tool called dynamic posturography that is the gold standard for quantification or measurement of balance, and we can measure numerous aspects of balance. But bottom line is that we need to have people in a controlled circumstance in an office setting to do these types of things. There are balance and other types of assessments we can do at home to get a general sense of how things are. But for the more advanced testing, it is office-based. So we move on to gait, or walking. Now, walking is simply an extension of balance. So we're balancing on 2 feet, and then we're essentially resisting falling all the time, and walking is looked at as a controlled fall. So we move our weight forward, and then we put 1 foot out to essentially break the fall, and then we continue to do that, putting 1 foot in front of the other. So that takes a good brain to do something like that. And gait, we can look at many, many different things. So the way somebody walks, we can observe, and we can look at, number one, is somebody walking with a very wide base? Are their feet far apart? If that's the case, the brain is needing that because it cannot get enough information with the feet close together to keep that person safe. So the wide base keeps them a little bit safer, but generally indicates a lower brain function. Shuffling gait, we see that in Parkinson's. So people's gait changes when their brain changes in conditions like Parkinson's. When people have labored gaits, when they're essentially having a hard time walking, the brain is not coordinating things very effectively. That speaks to a brain that is not working too well. We can look at things like when people strike their heel, or when they're standing what we call mid-stance between the heel and the toe movement. We can look at the toe off on the other side of that movement. We can look at the way people swing their arms or position their heads when they walk. If somebody's looking down all the time when they're walking, it tells us their brain is not comfortable relying on information from their feet and their knees and their hips and the balance system, that it has to look where it's going to maintain proper balance. That speaks to a brain that's having some challenges or problems. So many things we can look at here. Then we can do things, having people simply walk and doing some type of task, the walking and the walking and chewing gum type of thing. But this is a little bit more involved. We can have people do calculations while they're walking, and then we can see them actually stopping because they can't do both at the same time. That indicates cognitive dysfunction. And we can see that in people where we might not be picking it up on the examination or the history, because people can compensate very well, and they can often cover up their problems pretty well if they're not willing to be truly forthcoming. So we can do these types of tasks and really pick some things up and show people how broken down these systems might be. So gait needs to be assessed by an expert, as there are way too many parameters to evaluate for the person who's not trained in evaluating gait. Even the people that are experts in gait analysis or walking analysis, there's so much to be learned, because gait is one of the most poorly understood of neurological concepts. But we do understand the basics of balance and how we are essentially resisting falling as we're walking, and being able to control that is critically important to prevent injury, but also you need a really good brain to be able to do that effectively. So we need to do this in a safe environment at all times. Now we move on to cognitive testing. This is the one that most folks understand. If we're experiencing some type of cognitive decline or memory difficulties, we do cognitive testing. Now the MMSE, or the Mini Mental Status Evaluation, the MMSE, is one of the typical evaluations where we look at people being oriented to time and place and being able to copy images and things like that. Light calculations, that basically just tells us an overall kind of general mental status. It's not comprehensive by any means, but it can give us an opening or a window into cognitive function. So what I have up here on this particular slide is one of the types of cognitive testing batteries that we do in our office. And if you look, you see all these different factors of what we call neurocognition index. And I'll pull a little pen out here. So we have the neurocognition index here, and we have aspects of memory, mostly short-term types of memory here. We're dealing with psychomotor speed and reaction time, how fast are people reacting to things. Attention is really important. Attention is really important for learning. If we can't pay attention to things, we can't learn effectively. Things like cognitive flexibility and executive function are really important. So when we're looking at cognitive decline or memory decline, we look at things like the memory scores are really important to us. The attention is really important to us, and then the cognitive flexibility and executive function is very important to us. They're all important, but we have different what we call key performance indicators that are more important in certain situations. There's different performance indicators for brain injury, and there's different performance indicators for Parkinson's, different performance indicators for cognitive decline, etc. But right here, these three, these two, and this one right here are the most important for cognitive decline or memory challenges. So the memory scores, attention, cognitive flexibility, and executive function. And these things can be tested quite readily in most clinics, and we'll talk later about how that can possibly be done in your particular case if you're interested in looking at those types of numbers. So moving forward, we have eye movements. Eye movements can tell us a lot about the brain, because it is the brain that in fact controls the movement of the eyes. So eye movements tell us a great deal about your brain, and each type of motion or movement is associated with a different region of the brain. To simply hold your eyes on a target, we use a lot of capacity from our brain stem, which is a more primitive aspect of the brain and brain function. Also, too, the front part of the brain, the frontal lobes, have a lot to do with moving our eyes quickly. And then there's the parietal lobe, which deals with sensation, appreciation of sensation in the brain, that helps us move our eyes more slowly. So these are some generalizations, but we know if we move our eyes fast or slow or stop them, it's happening from different areas of the brain. So approximately 80% of learning occurs through our eyes. That is significant, because if our eyes are not moving effectively or appropriately, we will be shortchanging the brain in terms of the feedback that it needs to function optimally or to learn optimally. So if we don't move our eyes appropriately, if we can't hold our eyes on a target, or if we can't separate head and eye movements, we will have a significant challenge with learning. And most people that develop problems with their eyes and cognitive problems associated with that, they have trouble reading. They can read, and they have to read something 5 times before they can begin to understand it. And it's not necessarily a comprehension issue, but more of an eye movement issue. So video nystagmography, or VNG. It's the gold standard for measurement or quantification of eye movements, and there are a number of facilities that use this type of technology. Functional neurologists use it, ear, nose, and throat specialists use it, there are providers that use it for really different reasons, but in our case we're looking at these types of measurements as being related to balance function and higher cognitive function. Laboratory testing. So laboratory testing is the traditional biomarker, and we have a number of things we can look at. I'm going to really just cruise through this because I just want to expose you to the fact that there are things that can be looked at in the blood to talk about your brain. Now the first one is not standard. The cerebrospinal fluid can be looked at in terms of people that have rapidly progressive dementia. So if somebody's mind is falling in function over the course of a couple of weeks, they can do a spinal tap to access cerebrospinal fluid, and they may find certain proteins floating in that fluid, which S100B, the 1433, the rest of these types of proteins can be found in the cerebrospinal fluid to confirm that there might be something like Alzheimer's going on. These types of screens can also be looked at for indications of malignancy like tumors as well as inflammation. So blood sugar handling markers, that's really what's more accessible and more valuable to us in terms of trying to move brain function forward, because we have the understanding and the knowledge that so many people are impaired when it comes to handling blood sugar. Many of us are in a pre-diabetic state, if not a complete type 2 diabetic state, even if mildly. We see all the time where people think, you know, they haven't had their blood checked in many years, and we go ahead and look, and their fasting blood glucose and their hemoglobin A1C and all of these things are elevated, indicating they have type 2 diabetes, or at the very least a pre-diabetic state. So blood sugar handling markers are key to look at when we're looking at brain function, because if we're not getting fuel to the brain simply cannot and will not work well. Proteins in the blood can be looked at as well. These are under investigation and highly unreliable right now, so we won't talk much about that. And genetic testing is on the rise. More and more are looking at genetic testing, and there are markers like apolipoprotein, the ApoE. So apolipoprotein E4 is something that tells us about preponderance or tendency towards certain types of conditions like dementia and Alzheimer's. And there are certain dietary changes and things that can be put into place to hopefully decrease the expression of these deficient or malfunctioning genes. Diagnostic imaging. This is the last part of the biomarkers that we'll be talking about. So diagnostic imaging, we have structural imaging, which is CAT scan and MRI, which most people have heard of. And this can show us things like atrophy or shrinking of certain parts of the brain. It can show us changes in vascular systems. So has there been a blood clot or an infarct that's caused lack of blood flow to an area? We can see those types of things on these structural types of imaging. Now there's functional imaging that's really coming up in popularity and usage, and these are things like what we call positron emission tomography or PET scans. There's SPECT scans, functional MRIs. These things will show decreased blood flow. They'll show changes in metabolism or fuel delivery to certain parts of the brain. They can show changes in hydration or water status. So these things can really tell us what's happening when somebody's under a different task. You know, if somebody's thinking a certain thing or manipulating a certain object, what parts of the brain are being utilized based on the problem that they're solving or the activity that they're doing, and is this behavior consistent or normal with the databases of quote-unquote normal brains. So this is really exciting stuff, and really what the future of functional neurology is looking forward to, because there are things we can do now to look into the brain so we're not completely reliant on these markers from outside the body. So that's diagnostic imaging. So that wraps it up for part one of biomarkers of memory, clues from your body that tell us about your brain. Stay tuned for part two.